So in your presentation, I have the PDF, so it doesn't show the notes.
Okay. If you
So
open,
could you share the regular one with me? Yes. There.
yeah.
Oh, that's, oh, the K.
All right, this meeting will come to order exactly on time at 6 p.m. this on April 4th. We have a quorum with 4 committee members. Don't we? We have 3 committee members.
It's the voting members, so it's the board members plus me.
You would have quorum with whatever the voting total number is. You have half the voting member total.
So Cheryl is supposed to be here.
Okay.
Committee members. I'm ex officio and I'm a voting member, but I'm not, I don't count for.
Ex officio doesn't count towards quorum, so that's an extra stipulation, but I don't think it's all members.
It's voting members,
not
right.
No.
Right.
But we are
I
missing,
just didn't want to count name.
Yeah.
Maybe she's having a hard time to have on.
oh, there's Chris.
Even Laura.
So Laura's here, I'm here, Sarah's here, but Cheryl is, Chris is here. But Chris is also, can you text Cheryl to see if she's on her way? So you're a voting member.
I'm a voting member.
So 4 out of,
This is the only committee where administration.
Right. How many total voting members?
so we have 4 out of 7. So we're good.
Oh, you saw, yeah.
All right.
She's driving. I just got her driver notification.
Okay, and then Cheryl's on her way. Okay, so this meeting will come to order officially at 6:02 on April 4th. We have a quorum with the following committee members, Dr. Stephanie Pearson-Ugal, me, Devin Weibel, Sarah Lieberger, and on Zoom, Laura Gibbons. Can the people on Zoom hear us okay? We are also streaming to YouTube.
Yep,
Awesome.
I can hear.
Okay, I'm going to share a presentation so you can see our screen, and Dr. Glass, you will be up in a couple of minutes and I will enable your rights to share your screen as well.
Your sound is low, Devin, for the people speaking on the Zoom, so we can hear them. I just, you may be able to.
Oh, right.
The volume up.
Yes, I will figure out how to do that in 2 seconds. All right, first item on the agenda is public comment. If there is public comment, please remember to state your name, street, and town. Please keep my comments to 3 minutes or less and make sure comments are relevant to tonight's agenda. Is there anyone here for public comment? Great. Seeing none, we will move over to committee member comment.
I'd like to just say terrific to be in person. Good to see all of you.
Yeah, I think this is our first in-person meeting. So thank you for joining us. And I can't believe we're finally in person. It's only been a year and a half. And it's so nice to see people's faces. So thank you. Great, so let's move forward to approval of the minutes. The minutes are stapled to the agenda. Are there any changes or amendments or revisions to the amendments from the January 28th special meeting?
I don't think there was a motion to elect the chair.
Oh, wait, okay, what was it? You said there didn't need to be a motion in the minutes. I remember when I was taking minutes. So what would it be called?
Nomination.
Great.
Yeah. Open the floor for nomination. I'm sorry, could John ask me to run the election?
Any other changes? Great. So with the change, he then asked to open the floor for nominations for chair. Are the minutes approved? Is that by unanimous consent, absent objection? Great, seeing none, minutes are approved. And then we're going to move to the presentation of the DEI survey results. And so I'm going to invite Dr. Glass to share his screen.
So I'm just gonna let everyone know that this was actually not an additional analysis of the DEI survey results. This was an analysis of the subgroups for the student school climate survey. Remember that we had a very low participation in the DEI survey. And so the additional analysis we asked him to conduct had to do with the school climate survey, which was a much more robust participation.
Great, so Dr. Glass, I believe.
So I'm getting the host disabled participant screen sharing pop-up.
Oh, you know why, John, you're,
I got it.
okay,
He's got those now.
yep. Okay, you should be able to now. Sorry about
There
that.
we go. Not a worries.
Can you guys hear?
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, can everyone see the screen? Are we good?
Yep, we're great, thank you.
Thumbs up. It's bizarre. Stephanie asked me this afternoon if I was going to attend in person, and it had been so long since someone had asked me if I wanted to attend a meeting in person that it took me half a second to realize that I wasn't going to. It was a bizarre piece to ask. So what Stephanie and Jason asked me to do was to look at the student climate survey, both elementary, middle, and high schools, and do a subgroup analysis of that. So when I see the method for doing that, it becomes very difficult because the subgroup analysis, the subgroups that were there were relatively small in number. So we had on all three surveys differences between boys and girls in the elementary, as it was stated, and then males and females in the middle school and high school, as it was stated. In the middle school and high school, there were additional choices for gender selection, and at the high school, there were choices for ethnicity selections. The ethnicity did not occur in the elementary or middle school choices, so you won't see differences there. So basically, what we did was look at each of the groups individually, look at them portioned out by their subgroups, and then did a statistical comparison of them. In the groups that were relatively small, anything other than what ended up being male or female, it is statistically impossible to make a comparison between a group of 530 students versus a group of 8 students or 6 students. You can do some statistical magic to try to get there, but it is very, very difficult to draw an accurate analysis or an accurate conclusion of a large sample size and a small sample size. So when we did all of the analysis across all of the different subgroups across all 3 surveys, there were no statistically significant differences between any of the subgroups. There were no statistically significant differences between the entire survey, and then in the elementary schools, the males versus females. At the middle school, there were no statistically significant differences between the entire group, and then the males, females, and then any of the other gender subgroups. And at the high school level, there were no differences, even when we looked at males, females, and then the other gender identifications, added those with the different ethnicities, and then compared those to the larger group. So you'll see that as I go through. So for example, at the high school, we looked at males versus non-white males. We looked at white males who identified themselves in that category versus every other category. We did the same thing for females, and for all the different analysis that we did, and there ended up being 87 different analysis of subgroups, there were no statistically significant differences between them. And in almost all cases, the differences between the groups were within 6 or 7/10 of a point when you look at the averages. So when we start at the elementary school, 570 responses, 280 female, 283 male, and 7 other. There were no differences. The 7 other individuals, when we analyzed them, out of those 7, only 4 of those were complete responses. So it was difficult to do an accurate analysis of that. So even though there were no statistically significant differences, these were the 3 questions where we saw the biggest gap in the responses between female students and male students. And you'll notice that it is really, really small. I'm excited and interested about the things I learned at school. Across every survey that I've ever done when it comes to school climate, when it comes to students, there is almost always, and I can think of one example where it wasn't, where the females respond higher than males. It's just at the elementary level, that's just par for course. That's just what happens. I feel safe in my classroom and I feel happy. Females responded higher than males, but at a relatively small difference. For all of the other questions, the differences between the female responses and the male responses were 1/10 of a point, or they were exactly the same. At the elementary school, for a survey like this, that's not unusual, but it is unique in the fact that there were only 3 out of the 15 or so questions that popped out where that difference was only 2/10 of a point. I didn't write the survey. I didn't validate the survey. But looking at the questions, they're not unusual questions. They're not weirdly stated. So I wasn't surprised that these differences were what they were. You generally don't start to see differences in subgroups when you get to the middle school. And then generally it's later in the middle school. When we look at the middle school, that's the breakdown of what we saw in terms of gender. And again, there was no ethnicity on the middle school, so we're just looking at the gender subgroups. So what we did was we compared all the responses to females, males, 3 groups that you see below that: prefer not to respond, non-binary, and transgender. And we also created additional groups that were, we created one group that was all of the non-binary categories in terms of the prefer not to respond, non-binary, transgender. Those 3 groups were put together. Non-binary is not the right term, but anything other than male or female were grouped together. And then we grouped them individually. And then we did some work with the non-binary and transgender students, since the responses were so low, to try to give them the effect size that they would have if they were above 200. And what we saw, again, no differences, no statistically significant differences. So the 2 areas that to us, treat me fairly and with respect, the binary students, so those were just the male and the female. When we put those 2 together, when we compared them to all the others, 4.0 to 3.1. It was close to being statistically significantly different, but since the sizes of those groups were so different, when we did the analysis of it, it didn't come up as being statistically significantly different. And then the adults at my school treat me fairly. The binary students, that would be the males and the females combined, when compared to those 8 transgender students, we had that 0.7 difference. And the reason that there's the asterisk next to the transgender, since that sample size is so low, it's really, really difficult to give you a Pearson's coefficient or an independent sample t-test of what that would look like, because those differences are so much. We note it here because it is, when you look at the data, it's one of the ones that stands out because of the difference, but it's not statistically significant. So at the middle school, those were the differences that we saw. At the high school, it becomes more complicated because we have males, females, we have those other gender identifications, and then we also have the respondents for ethnicity, and students were allowed to choose multiple ethnicities, which is correct to do on a survey like this. So what we did in this, and the reason that the sub-analysis for this got so complex, is that we broke it down by all the male students who identified themselves as white or Caucasian versus all the male students who identified themselves as white or Caucasian and an additional ethnicity. So we did that for all of those subgroups. So for all of those, what we ended up seeing was, with the differences that we checked across gender ethnicities, when we cross gender and we cross ethnicities, again, no statistically significant subgroup differences. The youth mental health first aid trained students, those all students, that's every student combined. When you compare those to the non-binary students, so those are just the students who identified themselves as something other than male or female, you see a difference. I know how to report an incident of bullying. The white students versus the non-white students. So that would be any student who identified themselves solely as a white or Caucasian student versus students who identified themselves as anything but a white or Caucasian student. So there's a number of analysis that go into that. And those are the differences that we see for that. And then finally, I'm able to keep up with my coursework. The white or Caucasian students were at 3.4. The Hispanic or Latino students were at 2.7. And those were students who had just identified themselves as white or Caucasian versus students who just identified themselves as Hispanic or Latino. So there was a difference there. And this last analysis was not something that I would ever report as being anything remotely close to scientific. We basically looked at the students who identified themselves in some capacity as white or Caucasian, and then male or female, and then basically every other student. And what we saw with the differences between them was 6.5 versus 4.4. When we did the analysis of that to try to find the difference for that, it didn't fall into the p-value, the 0.05 p-value that we were looking for. And it's because we went through so many hoops to get those numbers, that to say that there was a really statistically significant difference between those, it's difficult to say, because to find those subgroups of students individually by themselves would be very difficult to do. So for all of those subgroups, for those 80 plus analysis that we did, I think the takeaway for us was that there were, in the questions that were the Likert Scale questions, there were no statistically significant differences between any of the subgroups. We looked at the open-ended questions and tried to analyze what the differences were in the open-ended questions. And the results that we drew from that was that anytime we saw a student make a comment that was negative towards anything, towards attitudes, towards teachers, towards classmates, towards procedures, towards feelings of safety, any individual response that was negative in any way becomes a statistically significant result. So as the district looks through and identifies those pieces, they should be able to pull out comments that were negative, and be able to address those. There were no patterns to those negative comments. We did not see any subgroups of students make comments that represented a pattern towards procedures, feelings of safety, areas of feeling safe within a school, any of the bullying metrics that we looked at. There were just individual comments that were made that were negative, and there weren't a lot of them. But the comments that were made did not follow a pattern based upon subgroup. Questions?
So what you said they didn't follow a pattern, but what were the nature of those comments without the extent that, you know, you don't want to identify anyone, but.
So they ranged the gamut from a student at X school. In the bathroom today, I saw a student say this to another student. I feel as if students treat me unfairly because I dress differently than my classmates. I feel as if, and I'm paraphrasing, these are not direct quotes. I feel as if students in school treat me unfairly because I talk differently than other students. There was nothing that we could analyze and put together and say a number of students made the same comment about the same thing, because each of the comments that were made were unique to the situation in the school that they were in.
Any other questions?
I'm curious about the breakdown. It's 3.4 white, 2.7 Hispanic, and then all of the responses. As a mother of a Black child,
Mhm.
I want to know where my Black child stood among the group that's lumped in. Particularly about the question of keeping up with the coursework.
So is the question, is there a reason that we don't see other subgroups reported in that question, in that category? Is that the question? Is that okay?
So as I pull up, so the reason that's not reported there is because it's not dramatically different than what you see in terms of the white student population. So when I look at the high school for that question, for the students who identified themselves as African American, feel like I'm able to keep up with my coursework. The average for Black or African American students was 3.3. So it's not on there because it doesn't fall within that difference. Basically, what we do with the difference is we look at any group that falls outside of the average and then identify who is on the group that's on the high end and then the group that falls outside of that. The Black or African American students fall within a statistically acceptable difference between both the white or Caucasian group and the Hispanic or Latino group, which is why it's not listed. Does that make sense? That was a super mathy answer to that.
So in contrast to that, the second bullet point where it asks students to, or whoever respondents to rate your overall experience. So if we say, so then I assume that on the scale, 6.5 is better than a 4.4, right?
Yeah, so that's on a scale of 0 to 10.
So then if I match up the 6.5 versus the 4.4, what this is telling me is if I take all the demographics from the previous slide that had white, binary, and then all other, right? This is saying that the all other have a different experience than the 6.5. Is that fair?
No. No, I would not say that, because again, when we say that the responses are not statistically significantly different, what that means is that the average of all of the students, the however many were in the high school, the 300 plus students in the high school, there were no subgroups that were statistically significantly different than the overall average. So when we say that the overall average for the entire community And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can pull up the data on my end and do it in a way that's not. When I look at the overall experience for all students, we get an average of 6.7. For all of the groups for that, they all fall in the first entity. They're all basically responding the same statistically. And I know that it looks different when it's a 6.5 versus a 4.4, but you have to remember you're looking at very, very different sample sizes in terms of those students who are white binary versus the students who are not. So while the numbers look different, I would not make the blanket statement that students at the high school who are white and binary who rate their overall experience different than all the other students do, because the statistics, the numbers do not support that.
Kevin, that particular question was on a 1 through 10. Were the
Correct.
other questions on a 1 through 4 scale?
So, and this where it gets difficult because of the survey. Many of the questions, there were a few open-ended questions. All the other questions were Likert scale questions. And a vast majority of them were on a 5-point Likert scale. And most of them were on the scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. There were a few questions that were Likert scale questions that were on a 4-point scale. So what I did to make all of the results the same, so that you could analyze them the same, the results that were on a 4-point scale, I just extrapolated that out as if it were a 5-point scale. So instead of the responses being 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they were fractions of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So for our purposes, for the statistics purposes, yes, all the other questions besides the rate your overall experience. And then there was another question in there about stress levels that was on a 1 to 10. All the other ones were on a scale of 1 to 5.
Great, Mike.
So was any of the data statistically relevant? Because I'm looking at everything that you have here, and I'm just wondering how it's relevant, how you make a comparison. In other words, when you're comparing a subset of 248 students with a subset of 8 students, if 2 of the 8 students mark 1s on everything, your results don't mean anything because it skews everything. Whereas if 248 students, if 2 students mark 1 on everything, you still have a better subgroup. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, so when you compared the small group, like a group of 8, did you throw out students? And throwing out is a hard way of saying it, but did you try to eliminate those students who might have had extreme responses and look at whether there was any value in looking at a smaller group, maybe of the 4 students whose responses were more in line with responses of other students? And I understand that the comparison is all over the place, because then you're throwing out responses from students that might have a valid
It's almost like the responses
but-
are dismissed. That's how I'm feeling.
yeah, and so like I said, I'm struggling to understand how you put this all together and make something of value, because you're comparing such different size groups that makes no sense to me.
Yeah, so for all of the surveys, regardless of who responded to the survey, we do an analysis of what each individual response is. So for any student that just puts in 1s straight across the board, or 5 straight across the board, or there was no differences in how they responded, all of those responses were flagged, regardless of what their backgrounds were. And there are questions worded differently, where a positive response would be a 5, whereas another question, a positive response would be a 1. And I'm assuming that whoever wrote the survey did that purposely so that you could flag students who just put 1s the whole way down. when we give you those response numbers, those were the number of students that were analyzed. Some data was removed from the survey, and the data that was removed, except for one instance, were students who answered just a single question and none of the others. There was one student who answered all of the questions as a 1, and then made a comment in one of the open-ended sections that led us to very clearly believe that they did not read any of the questions. They stated, "I did not read any of the questions," in their response. So we deleted that. So the responses that you see there are all the responses that were done and that were analyzed. Now, the question that you started with, what's the difference between the relevance and the significance of the data? I think there's a very strong, significant data set here. I think there's a lot of actionable data items that are in all 3 of these surveys. I do not, however, think that any of those action items should start with the differences between the subgroups, because the data did not support that. So there are responses that where the numbers for a particular question are low overall, that are actionable items, but there's nothing there that says that we need to look at a particular subgroup based upon this survey, not based upon the broader community, but based upon the survey. There's nothing there that says that additional attention should be focused towards a particular subgroup based upon any of the questions on any of the 3 surveys.
Good question. So we expect the subgroups to be small. I mean, it's a predominantly white community, cisgender. So we expect that the majority are going to be that. So isn't it important? Like, I feel like the information, even if it's a small group of 8 people that have a specific identity, that information is just as important to analyze, even if it's a small group of people. So is that information possible to show at like a percentage? So, the
So,
experiences.
So are you saying, so I guess, did you mentioned that you that you have the subgroups here are very small, but that you did some sort of statistical treatment with the smaller subgroup the subgroups, because they are smaller, to make sure that those numbers are still comparable to a larger group in different groups. So can you explain, like, when you're looking at the numbers statistically, you're not saying that because there's a smaller group of students in a subgroup that number, that you can't compare it, you have to do something to that smaller group to make it comparable, and that's why you're not seeing a statistical significance. It's not because the group is necessarily smaller only, it's because when you extrapolate it to be comparable to that larger group, that you're still not seeing that difference. Can you make that sound like, am I explaining that somewhat correctly, or can you explain what you did to the number?
So basically what we do is, for every single question, for all the Likert scale questions, we come up with an average response. So if it's on a scale of 1 to 5, it falls somewhere in that range. We then look at that and we create a column for every student. And let's do the middle school because it's the easiest. We do a column for every student, and then we do a column for females, males, not to respond, non-binary, and transgender. And then we do an analysis. We compare the means across all of those without doing any statistical transformations to make sure that we're looking at the same samples. And even when you have a sample of, and I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but like 250 versus 8, the means for those were really, really close. And we wanted to ensure that the reason that those means were really, really close is because we can take out the noise that occurs because you have a large sample size versus a small sample size. So we use SPSS to do all of our analysis with the statistics. There are transformations that you can do within SPSS where you put in the population, the sample size, and then it looks at all of those and then does a series of 3 statistical tests or transformations that will take anything that has a smaller sample size, like the 8, for example, and basically gives those responses the same weight as if it were the 250. So the way that I teach it, when I teach it, is imagine SPSS in the background, identifies how those 8 students responded, finds a pattern within those 8 students, and then imagines that those 8 students were now 250 students within that same population and creates a statistic for that. That's basically how the transformation works. Obviously, the smaller that gets, the more inaccurate it gets, and 8 is really pushing the limit of what we feel comfortable reporting. But that's basically how the statistics work. I agree that there is value in looking at how each of the individual subgroups responded to each of the individual questions. But my warning to that would be, you're going to see some questions where there is a 0.6 or a 0.7 difference. And instinctively, you'll look at that and say, there's a different experience between these students who are in this subgroup versus the entire population. And statistically speaking, that is not true.
Kevin, when you said before, when you calculated your p-test, you calculated the p-value and you did a t-test, was your, was like, did you put like bullying as the dependent variable, and what did you do to the 2?
No, so we look at each of the individual questions in and of themselves. Since I did not look at the survey and I didn't see any of the statistics to how the survey was chosen or validated, I was not able to group questions based upon subject. So generally, when you see a survey, a climate survey, you have a number of questions that address a particular topic. And in school climate surveys for students, bullying is generally one of them. So in a validated survey, you would see 5 or 6 questions that all address the idea of bullying in a different way. There'd be 5 or 6 questions that ask students how they felt about bullying on a number of different parameters. And then you would then be able to take those 5 or 6 questions as a group and then make a broader statement about bullying in the school community. I did not do that in this analysis, and I can't because I don't know any of the back-end data for how this survey was developed or where the questions came from.
How many questions were asked on these interviews?
So on the high school survey, there were a total of 60 Likert scale questions, along with a smaller subset of open-ended questions. In the middle school, it was 16 questions, Likert scale questions. And then in the elementary school, it was 25 Likert scale questions.
Okay, so the question that I have is this. The purpose of this task force, from what I understand, has always been to hear the voices of those who are not in the majority. And yet again, here's another set of data that is presented that is very strictly condensed, that really tells us nothing other than that everyone is having the same experience. To which I asked them, what work are we doing here?
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? Because apparently everyone's having the same experience, so we're done.
And I think a part of what Dr. Glass's last answer touched on is it's the design of the survey to a certain extent, which limits our ability to get to really understand
To an
that
extent,
question.
yes,
Yeah.
but if the whole idea is that we're going to try to apply the weightings as we've done, whereas if you were to take a look at it as percent of universe in those audiences, percent of universe respondents, you would really be able to look at a totally different experience. And we as a committee would actually have data to use to actually apply to. So once again, this is, I don't see what the benefit of all this is, because as it did with the DEI survey, here we are, another set of data that's simply telling us everyone's having the same experience. I mean, the thing is, the existence of this task force causes division in our community.
Yes.
If the work that we've done is showing that we don't have a problem, then we should disband the task force.
I don't want to respond to that statement. I would just like to say that the data in and of itself does not support the idea that there are no differences between subgroups within the school community, right? What the data shows you is that according to those surveys, that there is no evidence of that.
But we also understand that the sample sizes that we're working with are going to be tremendously challenging statistically. But the district reports, for example, on the number of kids by ethnicity, there's different ways of doing that. We could even just look at it strictly as percent of universe who answered. That will give us a whole different story than the way it's been presented here. That is usable data.
From my perspective, if we interrogate the data we have from this survey or any other surveys we've done, and it doesn't help us to uncover what we've heard anecdotally or what we understand to be the experiences of individuals who've spoken up, then we need to figure out, I think, you know, your point is, if all we're going to say is everything's fine, well, then there's no point for us to meet.
Because this is causing so much division in our communities.
I agree, but if we are going to really try hard to understand what the experience is, I think it's more than just, we've only taken one swing at this, right? And I think we say, let's hear more from the experts this time around as to the sort of process of gathering the data through the climate survey. How do we make sure that that process is thoroughly scientific and results in our ability to bring more meaningful, you know, analysis to this, as opposed to having to discount a lot of that along the way.
I'm getting a little bit frustrated because we're talking about children's lives.
Yes.
We're talking about their future, and I don't care about scientific data. I don't care about statistics. I want to know if there are two children in Joe Barlow that are suffering, that are not having the same experience as everybody else.
Yeah.
Throw the scientific data out. Let's figure out how to reach those two children.
Yeah, I think
I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that we're spending a lot of time trying to force surveys and making these surveys, you know, accepted by the towns, and that's not happening. It is causing a lot of division. Why don't we focus on the kids who are struggling? Why don't we focus on making sure that, you know, we're providing them safe spaces?
So, and
I
the
guess
other
go
thing
back
that I
to-
would, if I could add one more thing to that. Dr. Harrison said it, and when we looked at the DEI survey, one of the things that was said, and Dr. Glass, you yourself said it, if one child is having an experience, we need to know about it, but yet we threw all of that out, right? And said we can't use that. So here we are again, doing the same thing.
I think we have to go back to sort of a year and a half ago. We said, here we are as a group. What are we going to do? What are our goals and objectives? And how are we going to get there? And it was a conversation then about creating focus groups, the opportunity for conversation. And then the conversation steered to, let's take one step back and let's understand what the baseline is. And the best way to understand what the baseline is with a diagnostic tool, a survey, a climate survey. And whether the results of that lead to meaningful understanding of what's going on or not is a result in and of itself. And the result is, hey, this survey and this tool is not reaching those students that we've heard from on an anecdotal and individual basis. And so, well, we can recognize that broadly, here's what's going on. And that's the baseline we were looking for. We also know what it's not doing. And that, to me, informs some of what the next steps are, all the same as if they had identified them.
So I think we also have to remember that Dr. Glass was hired to do a statistical analysis of a survey that's not statistically valid in its construction. So I think it's been a challenging task, I don't want to speak for him, to do the type of analysis that he's trained, what he understands how to do, because I'm sure if it were up to him, we would have a more consistent number of responses to the questions. He would understand the statistical backend. We've had a number of conversations that have been really helpful in terms of understanding how we could improve the survey. And as Chris said, we didn't set out to give a survey in the first place. We wanted to hear the voices, and we were challenged by the obstacles, especially during remote learning, that were placed before us to gather those voices. I think that those of you who sit on a school climate committee would say that the conversations, especially those that include students, are very rich because they're looking at the survey data, but then they're also hearing the students tell stories. They're hearing about the students explain their experiences in school, in bathrooms, in hallways, on the playground, on the school bus, and that's where we gather more information. It's certainly not perfect. We certainly need to gather more information about those that have not felt respected, have not felt safe, have felt marginalized. But I don't think that we can discount the analysis that was done, because remember, there were questions about the validity of the results of the survey. And that's why last summer, Dr. Glass was hired to come in and validate that, in fact, the DEI survey was truly taken straight from SurveyMonkey. Remember, there were questions about whether perhaps the results were doctored in some way. And so that's really what he was hired to do. Because the DEI survey has such a small participation rate, he then turned to the climate survey with the hope that it would give him a larger data set to be able to analyze. And as you're seeing, he's presenting the statistical analysis, but I didn't hear him say that the responses weren't important.
But what did it tell us? I don't see what it tells us aside from that everyone has the same experience.
I think
Yeah,
it gives
I'm not
us
sure.
one information that when we, well, one, I think looking at one data point or one set of data to get answers about kids' experiences is really challenging, because if a kid had a really bad experience or a really awesome experience that week of school, you could potentially have somewhat skewed results. I also think when like last year, when there was an equity audit done at the high school, looking at participation rates, SAT, PSAT scores, they looked at National Honor Society, they looked at multiple other indicators, and you did actually start to see some things that required further follow-up. So I would hope that it's not, we're going to look at this and this is like the answer to everything. I think it's, okay, so what differences do we see? And he did point out some key areas that I think could allow for further investigation. We know that the survey that we used last year is not the best tool to answer some of the questions that we have about experiences of especially marginalized students. And then there's potentially what other information could be valuable and how could we get that information, whether it's climate surveys or focus groups, or are there other types of data that so for example, in elementary school, do we see differences in Dibble's basic indication of reading performance or math performance in different subgroups? Like you can start to look at also other pieces of information and triangulate it with hopefully a more valid survey set to better understand the experience of students just in the data. But also I think we need to listen to the experiences that our families and kids are having, so that it's not just about a number, but also about their lived experience as they kind of exist in our schools every single day.
So when we say listen in what form, and how is that presented in a way for us as a committee to be able to use that? Like, what are we talking about? Listen, I thought these surveys were the opportunity for us to listen.
I think it's one way that we listen. I think that what I'm hearing is, and again, I think when you look at data, we have one set of data here. We had a DEI set of data that, again, unfortunately had a very small sample size. So there's only so much that can but I think when you take that data and you combine it with this data, and then potentially we find other information, I know we've talked about focus groups, but I don't think that's something that this committee does. I think it's something that we look at our boards to do, and then not to do to conduct, but potentially to commission our operational teams in the buildings to do with a third party.
No, I'm still perplexed, like why the DEI survey, there was a low response rate, but the majority of the responses were from minority groups. So why wouldn't that information be valuable?
Oh, I think it is
I
valuable.
think it's very valuable.
So
I think what he said is that it wasn't statistically significant in terms of the differences. And it had a very low end, but we read all of those responses very carefully, and it was shared and discussed with the school climate teams and with the district climate team.
So the word significance, statistical significance is a sciencey term. It is not a value judgment term. So when we say something isn't statistically significant, it's not a value judgment on the significance, the actual, like, is this an important or significant thing for us to know? It's just the data is saying that when you apply some t-test and you look at the p-value, that value isn't large enough to determine a large enough difference between those two groups to say that there's a scientifically significant thing. We could, so it's not a value judgment, it's just what numbers are saying. I think that when you combine what we know from the DEI survey and the voices that came out of that, and like the experiences that have come out of that, the stories that we've heard in board meetings, and many of us may have heard from friends and families, and then what's going on in the climate committees, there's really important work that should continue.
But what was presented to the public left everyone thinking that it's just not usable. So what it looks like, and again, I'm going to say, we have to live in this, right? So what you guys put out, what this was just put out, it looks like now this is the second survey that shows there isn't an issue and everyone's having the same experience. And then it looks like somebody is pushing an agenda to force this onto the community. And then we're the ones who bear the brunt of the community's anger because of this. Like, I know that there were like about 21 families of color who answered the DEI survey, reporting on 28 of their students. When I look at the numbers that the district submits in terms of ethnic makeup, that makes up about 50%. So we had a 50% response rate from people of color in the DEI survey. But yet that was put aside. Like, where is that information? What are those experiences showing? Because the presentation I looked at just said, we didn't have enough information and it's not really usable.
Yeah, and I heard comments like
So-
it does not follow a pattern. You know, some items did not warrant a conversation. Action, what is it? Actionable data items, not comparable. Like, when I hear those phrases, it seems like it's almost like the information is irrelevant or it doesn't matter. And that's what triggered me, really.
It's triggering, that's the
Yeah.
word. It's
So,
very
yeah, but
triggering.
but put aside by whom? Because what I'm hearing is different from, like, so you have a third party, no offense, Kevin, Dr. Glass, from Ed Advance coming in to do a statistical analysis and look at it from a scientific lens where he is being asked to apply a specific type of test to say, are these numbers statistically different? And then, but what I'm hearing is whether that bears out, if there's a statistical difference, there's still a lot of work being done by the district themselves. And we could say, or the districts themselves, and maybe we say we want more insight into that is using all of that information and data, whether it be from the DEI survey, from our climate surveys, and from other sources of information. Yeah.
Kevin,
I think it would be very helpful to incorporate all of that other information. Apologies if I'm talking over someone. I have a hard time hearing everyone, but you know, I didn't join all of the meetings last year, but I joined some of the meetings last year and they were all just about surveys. And now today's agenda is just about surveys. And so we're forgetting the fact that data doesn't just mean survey data. There's all kinds of qualitative data that we're not focusing on here. And I think is really relevant. And I'm not criticizing Dr. Glass's work at all. My educational background is in statistics. My professional background is in research. I know exactly, what you're doing here, and I think it's very relevant and important, but we are completely missing that other qualitative piece. And I don't see anything about that on tonight's agenda. When are we going to talk about that? Because that's the stuff that's really impactful here.
That's a very excellent point, and I'll just follow up with what I was going to say. When we put this committee together, we weren't looking to have statistically significant experiences. We were looking to hear about the people who are completely on the periphery. And we knew they weren't going to be statistically significant. So yeah, it's important, if we're going to do a survey, and this is now the second one that we're doing, and we're saying your experience is out of the norm, so we're gonna set aside, because we want you to be part of this, to mirror this. Don't do that, because we can't keep going back asking people in marginalized communities to pour their hearts and experience in, and then to just stifle it the way that we've done in both these surveys. That's one point. And the other point, I do agree with you in terms of the other data for us to use. I'd be happy to hear it. But part of that is, how is that data captured? How is it used? Who interprets those experiences, whether it's conversations or incidences? How is that all done? Because as a committee, what is our role if we're not given anything to analyze, to work with? All we're doing is telling the world we have a DEI task force, but we're not doing anything.
Can I just make a point?
Yeah.
I've been here for 6 months, and I've been on a few of these meetings, and all you've talked about is data. And I think it's a problem, because we're not talking about education, teaching or learning. We keep talking about the survey. We keep wanting to analyze the data, analyze the subgroups, look for differences. And we have to start changing our focus and start focusing on teaching and learning, and start looking at our curriculum and looking at teaching differences, biases, stereotypes, empathy, history, cultural sensitivity, microaggressions, inclusions. There's so many things we need to focus on, and we keep coming back to data. And you're not going to find, to Dr. Glass's point, significances between the data if you're asking the questions that have been asked the way they've been asked. And so you can either take a different approach and start looking at qualitative information and truly interviewing students and talking with students and looking at focus groups. But even that's just more data to analyze. I don't think the task of the committee should be to analyze anything. I think the task of the committee should be focusing on helping the educators start designing experiences where we can start doing what we are trained to do, which is developing curriculums, developing lesson plans, and start teaching some of these really important concepts. And along the way, you could probably start designing better tools that measure different areas in more valid and reliable ways. So if you wanted to look at bullying, the reason why I asked about, did Dr. Glass look at a particular topic with a dependent variable and then compare different subgroups? And he said, well, you didn't have enough questions in that particular area. And you design a tool that can do that. And I think you can. There are tools out there. But the most important thing, right, is actually to start focusing on teaching and learning, because we're not going to move forward. And that's truly what I feel like we need to spend more time. I'd love to see an agenda item in the future. I don't know when, focused on in that area.
Well, I think one of the first agenda items that I would like to see regarding teaching and learning is, how are we going to make sure that what we teach is inclusive of all different cultures? Because that's been a big issue around town as well. So I am all for everything that you just mentioned. I agree that students need to have a real experience in school where they can graduate high school and go out into the world and not be afraid of the color of the person's skin, and not be afraid to sit down and have a meal and have a meaningful conversation and get to know everyone just because they're human beings. I'm all for that. But when I hear people around town talk about we shouldn't indoctrinate kids, if we teach something about a different culture that may offend us or make us feel uncomfortable, how are we going to accomplish that? And I'm not looking for anybody to be pussyfooting around this. Like, my daughter is a Black child. She's in the 10th grade. And it is my responsibility to teach her things about her culture. She hasn't experienced it in school, or at least not enough of it. It's skinned over. And I'm not just advocating for Black children. I'm advocating for the Asians and the Hispanics. I'm advocating for everybody. And so if we're going to do that, I want to applaud you for, speaking on the subject and committing to doing it. But it's time for us to stop playing games with this and be real about it. Like, I want the white kids at Jogabalo to walk out of here knowing where Dominica is, because that's where I'm from, find out about what everybody likes to eat, the music they like to listen to, you know what I mean? What makes us move as human beings. I want all the kids from Balo to walk out of here feeling that. And similarly, I want my daughter to be able to appreciate the culture of her white friends who have roots in Ireland and Italy. I want that for her too. So that's why I'm sitting here like feeling a little bit almost triggered, because I see too much of this nonsense around town. It's not taken seriously. And we have a beautiful campus. My God, it's like the kids in Bridgeport would die for this. Every time I come, I feel blessed if my daughter can come to a school like this. But at the end of the day, what are we putting out into the world? That's why I don't care about, first of all, I never liked math. So that just aggravated me. It just really aggravated me because I was not a math student. It's not my strong point, but I'm about all of us here as people being, unafraid to get together in somebody's backyard and, have a beer, have a glass of wine, have some coffee, whatever our choice is, and not be afraid, not be inhibited, not feel like, oh my God, I can't go. It's around town. It doesn't make me feel good as a parent. It doesn't make me feel safe. And it doesn't make me feel safe.
Can I suggest, I agree, I love sort of all the, in the sort of trajectory of the discussion. When we're talking about the data, it matters, but here, as a part of a larger approach, and that we need to bring more than just data back to this committee. We need to bring back some of the qualitative findings. We need to bring back some of the conversations that are happening. Let's hear about what's happening in the curriculum, like those kinds of things. I want to give Devin this as her first meeting where she built the agenda, a pass, because I think this committee was sort of, coalesced around the surveys and that data as this is our thing, without saying, hold on a second. It is just as much about that one child who's having that awful experience.
And that's my point. We need to hear from that one child. I don't want to see that one child not be heard.
Yeah, and so we have to figure out how to bring the sort of findings from the one child back to this committee as well, so that we can champion sort of all the children of this community. So I'm very moved by that. I like it's new life, because coming here and talking about survey data is not exciting. It's important, but it's one piece. So I know it's not on the agenda, and this is a special meeting, which means we can't add things to the agenda, but I think we probably have, of the people who helped to inform the agenda, I think commitment that that's going to be there in the future.
Yeah, I think it would be our preference to be talking about exactly that. I mean, I just want to remind everyone that it was a decision to do this statistical analysis, not necessarily because the task force felt that was all that was important. I mean, you all remember the conversations that we had as a group well before there was any talk of creating a survey. And it really had to do with hearing the voices and how could we get those voices, especially during a time when we were learning remotely. We talked about how could you have an in-person gathering? Could we just invite people to come together? And what would that look like? And I think that's when we ultimately decided, you know, this is going to be really tough to run a focus group if there's nothing to inform the focus group.
Is Dr. Glass still reading?
And are there any further questions for Dr. Glass?
I was just curious about, I'm on the school climate committee as well, and there was a huge concern for bathroom safety. And I'm just wondering if that was analyzed at all.
Let me go through the questions.
That was, I'm only on the elementary one, so I don't know about the other schools, but
There's a question about feeling safe, and the bathroom is one of the choices.
Classroom, cafeteria. So the average for that was, and the question was, in the school, I feel safe in the bathroom. The average for that for all students was 3.4 out of 5. For boys, it was 3.4. For girls, it was 3.4. And then for the students who chose other, it was 3.0.
Was there a stratification of LGBTQ?
No, not in the elementary school survey.
Elementary school.
Oh, elementary.
well, yeah, there was other at that point.
Correct.
There wasn't the high school. or
At the high school, it was.
Yeah.
In middle school.
So is that data for the middle as well?
So in the high school survey, there was not a question specifically about restrooms, bathrooms. And there was not a question specifically about that in the middle school either.
Kevin, everything was reported as the mean on a Likert scale. Do they also follow a normal distribution, or were there any questions or areas for which there was?
Yeah, yes, there were a few that did not, but we adjusted those statistically so that they would be analyzed as if they were.
I'm just wondering if there's any areas where it popped out with lots of 5 and lots of 1s, but not a normal distribution.
No, I mean, most of the responses were skewed to the right, just because that's the nature of climate surveys, but they did have what we would consider to be a normal bell curve to them.
Thank you.
And skewed to the right, I mean, towards the 5, which is the strongly agree side.
Yep. Any questions on Zoom?
None for me.
Great. All right, Dr. Glass, thank you for your time. Thank you for
Thank you
your,
all so much.
appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you want me to come sit?
Yep.
Come sit?
Even though, yep. Okay, so Dr. Pearson-Ugal is going to give us an update on the school climate surveys. So she can.
So since we just had this wonderful conversation about how we think that surveys and looking at data is probably the least important part of our work, we're going to spend a little more time talking about it. So I will move quickly and certainly just tell me where you have questions. So I'll just look up, it's easier. In looking at our school climate survey, which is done annually, this is a requirement by the state that we conduct a climate survey. We do it annually. It could actually be done every other year. We do it annually, and we survey students in grades 2 through 12, parents and staff members. And the reason why we do it is to gather feedback from all of the survey participants to determine whether we have a climate that is physically, emotionally, intellectually safe, free from bullying, harassment, and discrimination, and then also to track our progress.
Now, I will say that over the years, we've been doing these surveys since about 2012. The district climate team, which is made up of the assistant principals in every building, they look through the responses, and where it seems as if students were unsure about a question or the response was very low, there are times where, meaning students skipped the question. There are times that they will change the question. Also, if students express a concern in a particular area, they will try and tease that question out further so that they can gather more information. So when I'm talking about tracking progress, this is not done in a statistical manner, as you were describing by Dr. Glass. I don't believe that any of the people who serve on that committee are statisticians. And so our work as educators is very much on the qualitative end. So we are really looking at the open-ended questions. Surveys that one would purchase are typically forced choice. They don't have any opening questions because that's very difficult to analyze. And yet for our work, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to read the open-ended responses so that we can better understand students, staff, and parents' experience in our schools to support a safe climate. So for that reason, we do have a number of open-ended questions, even though any statistician would say that's problematic. So that's
Can we present that on the Zoom?
Sure.
You can't see. I tried to share the screen. Hold on one second.
Yep.
You should close it. Can you see it now?
Yeah, yeah. I guess we could see it before it was just on a blank slide.
Oh, is it on the right side now? Can you see slide?
Yeah, climate survey purpose. Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. So are there any questions about the purpose in general?
I'm just wondering, why are first graders included? Just curious.
Reading ability to answer questions,
So,
honestly.
but they read the questions to the students, right?
No, I don't think they do. I think the students take the survey independently. Kelly, you're a second grade teacher.
They can request, but we don't read the whole survey aloud.
Yeah.
Are kindergarten, first grade parents, those still a part?
Yes.
Of it?
Yes. All parents are invited to participate. Yeah, absolutely.
You don't want someone reading the whole survey. And you can have perception of bias, depending on how you intimate certain words,
Right.
et cetera. It could affect how the answer comes.
Sure.
I'm just curious about,
Yeah.
You mentioned this work's been done since 2012.
Yes.
Do you have evidence of progress? What can you list as some of the
Yeah.
things that have been done that, you can look back on and say, things are not the way they used to be in this regard?
Sure. One of the questions that was mandated by the state, and the surveys really came to school districts as a result of bullying legislation. So it's really helping us to build a safer school climate in every way that we interpret safety. One of the required questions had to do with whether students saw an adult in the school community as a trusted adult that they could go to. That's been a consistent question every year. We would like 100% of the students in our schools to say, yes, there is at least one trusted adult. That seems like just an absolutely critical component of having a safe school climate. We have not had 100% of students say that. And every year, the climate committees talk about how they can make adults in the community more visible, staff members. So over the years, you've seen bulletin boards with pictures of staff members, with bios of staff members. There have been efforts to bring staff members into classrooms that wouldn't typically have a role in the classroom, so that kids can get to meet other staff members than they might typically see in their school day, so that they can see that they are part of a caring, safe community. So that's an example of one of the areas that's been a focus. And there are certainly others as well. So I could bring back more specific information from,
We're required to do the school. climate.
we are,
That's-
yes.
That's why.
We are required by
Because that's
statute.
The new way of discipline kind of, anyway, I don't want to go into it. Again, I apologize if I'm overstepping here because I've watched several meetings on Zoom, but I haven't been a member of the committee and I haven't really given a lot of input, but I'm listening to what everyone's saying and so many points make sense. And to me, the wider your reach, the less likely you are to ever accomplish anything, right? So now we're doing school climate. We're talking about issues that are curriculum related, right? We're looking at data to kind of provide evidence that we have different experiences for students. And so I don't know, I look at it more like, so it's got to be easier to focus on the small subset of students who may not be having the same experience that everyone else is, and determine why. Again, in an appropriate, discrete way, but to figure out why their experiences are not the same and how you change it to make them the same, rather than you spend 3 years or 4 years trying to figure out the whole, problems of the world. And by the time you get to anything concrete that can actually be actionable, students are already out of school and on somewhere else. Each cohort gets lost. So the quicker you can get to something that is going to have a positive effect on students, the more effective the committee is. And so I'm looking at it and I'm saying, it seems like every time we start to narrow it down, we start to blow it back out again. And I'm looking at it like you're never going to reach any measure of success unless we can focus on what that objective is, that main objective. If this is the DEI committee, there's a school climate committee already, right? So why are we doing school climate in DEI? I'm just wondering why.
There is not a school climate committee that's a board committee.
No, there's no
And
board
that
committee. school.
and it's been something that's really bothered me for a time. It's like, we should find another name for it because it causes that confusion.
And it's nothing like this. I'm on it.
It's an internal working, it would be like saying there's a vice principals committee or,
No, but I do understand, and I understand what the climate survey is, and I would almost guarantee you, if you go back to 2012, when we talk about, are we making progress, it's basically the same. It's not changing a lot.
But it's like, so it's a question, why are we talking about the climate survey tonight if we, so this has been an ask from the committee, is to better understand what the climate survey process is, why do we do them, and then how has some of the suggestions that have come from this group, from the experiences we had last year, kind of informed the climate survey, not for this year that we're going to be doing in the later spring. And then how can we get more information earlier, right? We're getting a climate survey review, it is April 4th, and this was from data that was garnered back in May. And so trying to now have a better process and system, I 100% agree. Our goal, first of all, shouldn't be that everybody has the same, it should be that everybody has exactly what they need. Like our goal in schools is to meet the needs of kids, which is the definition of equity. And I think some of the challenges are that the experiences that many marginalized students have, when we try to approach those from a typically white heteronormative lens, the approach is not culturally responsive and doesn't meet the needs of that student in that moment, and we can come off as very tone deaf or not meeting that need. And I think what I'm hearing tonight is there's more, there's a desire to really understand what are we doing to be more culturally responsive in our pedagogy and in our teaching and learning at the student level and across different schools and environments. And then what other qualitative data are we, and when I say data, I like, what other qualitative stories, experiences are we hearing from our community that will better inform our response as a committee, but also how are we better responding in the moment in the schools?
Mhm.
Okay.
And that's the same for LGBTQ.
Yes.
That's a huge vulnerable population.
Correct. And so this agenda was crafted with the request of, and again, the request probably back in November. So in fairness, we haven't met in a while, to make sure that we have a clear understanding of the quantitative data that we have, and also how I do want to say the work of this committee has informed the climate process in the schools. There's been a huge amount of change in a very short amount of time to have a much more school by school approach, but also data teams that come together and review data, and then also a third party source who comes in and brings a lens that is unique from kind of the school lens, so that there's more open communication. This is the first time since I've been a parent in this district now for 6 years that climate data has been talked about openly in public. And I think that's an important step to saying, okay, we have questions, let's ask those questions so that things can't just be brushed under, right? So I think this is a step in a direction that we need to continue, but we need to do more.
I just think there's overlap between the DEI task force and climate, because the types of questions you ask in climate should be aimed at marginal groups and their experiences. And so I think that's the.
Could you say that again? I didn't hear you.
I think that there's overlap between climate and the DEI task force, and the reason why we're talking about climate tonight is because the climate surveys have asked questions about students' experiences in school, and obviously when we care about students' experience in schools, we care about all students, particularly our marginalized groups. So I think that's why we're talking about it.
I think we do have to be mindful of the idea that this isn't the climate committee or a climate committee. And the point of this group isn't strictly climate oriented. And the way I've always seen it is as an advisory group that links to a lot of different facets of what we do. And so that's going to be advising and providing feedback in the area of curriculum. It's advising, providing feedback in the area of climate, but not exclusively climate. It's advising even, onto calendar and what holidays we recognize. It's things like that. But because this group got into the direction a year ago of, we're going to start with the survey, it became the survey team and the climate team. And I think that's done a disservice to really the mission of the organization of this group going back almost 2 years. If we look at how it was formed and why it was formed and what the vision of it was. So I'm looking forward to talking about this and then not talking about climate surveys again for a while. Not because they're not important, but because I think it is narrow the focus of this group so severely that it's lost sight of the bigger picture and the bigger potential.
And I think later on in the agenda, there's going to be a discussion of the committee membership. And I think then with more voices in this conversation as well, we can also talk about the charge of the committee, and that's really Devin's to run. But the charge of this committee is so incredibly broad that I think in the early meetings, we stumbled a little bit to try and figure out what our role was. And I remember the conversations of, so are we supposed to be looking at books? Should we be, and it was a little unclear. So I think that perhaps it might make sense to look at that charge and really think about.
I've got it up right now.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I'm like,
Can I ask a question before we start? Tell me if I misunderstood this or not, or maybe I'm thinking something different, but wasn't there some money put aside for us to get a DEI specialist?
Not a DEI specialist. So all of the operating budgets in Eastern Reading Region 9 have money for consulting. In Easton, that amount was reduced. But there is money for consulting and that would support the work of DEI and more generally climate.
Because it seems as we're trying to streamline the role of this task force, it would benefit us to have someone who's experienced in doing that work to help us navigate, so we don't go down a path and yet one more path and find out that we've misstepped again. I think this is where someone who's been doing this and been doing this in schools can be tremendously beneficial to us. If I thought it was something like 40,000, I could be wrong. I don't remember what the initial amount was, but it just seems like it would really help us, I guess, define the role and also prioritize where to go.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Right.
So I wouldn't necessarily say that we're trying to narrow the focus.
Not
right?
narrow, no.
I think in many ways, we're actually trying to sort of get back to what the charge originally was, and that is to pay attention to a lot more than just surveys. Which is good. My other comment is, because this is a special meeting, we do have to be faithful to the agenda. And I hate to be the guy who's always the FOIA police. But I want to make sure that we are being faithful to that. And I think we have tons of opportunities in just amongst our charge to dive into really meaningful work that's going to help kids. I also agree that I think we need some guidance. We need somebody who's going to help us make sure we don't make additional missteps. As we get into some of these other topics.
Like, what if someone come and speak to our group specifically on various topics that
that are in our charge? It would be really helpful to have that kind of advice. I know we're losing some people.
We're going to lose some people, but that's, that's certainly something that we can explore. And there is money in the operating budget to do that.
I think getting back to the agenda and the sort of school climate, school climate surveys, I think that will be really useful to sort of get through that. But I don't know that we necessarily need deep discussion on sort of the elements of that. It seems like discussion of possible action would probably have a more meaningful discussion in committee membership and application process.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really just wanted to review, to go over the purpose for the survey with the entire group, because I do think it's been confusing and I'll be honest, fraught, especially in the past year with everything that this task force has experienced with perception and the role of the committee and the use of the term survey and what that means and what our intent is. So I just wanted to clarify the purpose of the climate survey, which is an annual survey that is required by the state and something that we take very seriously in our schools and in our work with parents, staff, and students. So that's the purpose. I can go pretty quickly. I shared all of the survey elements. The survey elements, I skipped one, are taken from the National School Climate Standards. And this is a document written in 2007, was adapted by ER9, but basically it falls into the categories of safety, and you can see the breakdown there. Learning focus, relationships, sense of place, and professional community.
Can you go back one?
Yes. Yeah. So I have a breakdown of the questions. I know we want to move on past survey, but I had some examples of every one of the categories just to give people a flavor of what that's all about. But I will
The only question
keep moving on.
I'm on my middle school's task force. No.
Climate committee?
Committee.
See? See, that's what happens.
I am on it. And so I do know the questions that are asked. The questions
Yes.
that I have as we're looking to standardize these
Yes.
across all of our schools, so that we can use them for trending data down the road, for trending purposes down the road. So if this is something required by the state, do they provide standardized questions?
Yeah,
Is there a
that's
way
an
to
excellent
compare us
question.
against how other schools are performing, how we compare against other schools, et cetera?
We don't have a state data set with which to compare our local results. For a number of years, the state told every public school district in Connecticut which questions that were mandated by the state, and then we were able to add our own. And you can see there are different numbers of questions on each one of the surveys, and that's also changed over the years. While I can't give a definitive reason why, it could be lack of funding at the state level. There really are not the same number of consultants in this area at the state level to maintain this is the required set of questions. So if you were to go to the Connecticut State Department of Education website and look at climate, you would find a whole website dedicated to this topic with many valuable links, but you would not see these are the 10 questions that every school district must ask. So because this was born out of bullying legislation, the initial set of questions had to do with bullying and harassment. And again, having someone at school that students could turn to, a trusted adult, and to try and gather information about the extent to which students feel safe in their school community. But the state does not offer an opportunity for us to take a look at a state data set and do any type of comparison, unfortunately.
So we can only compare against ourselves.
So we're really only comparing internally. So when I go further, I'll talk to you more about what we hope to do this spring in this area.
At the last meeting,
Yeah.
Dr. Glass had mentioned that there was a standardized.
Yes, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide when we talk about our plan for next year. All right, so in terms of looking at this spring's climate survey, the district, the ER9 district climate team truly wanted to find a standardized tool that we could administer so that we could get away from some of the criticisms that we've heard regarding the survey. And so that whether we are relying on a tool that has norms that are sort of baked into it, or whether we're hiring an outside consultant to come in and do the analysis, we know that the survey construction is sound, right? In our research to find such a survey, we narrowed in on the National School Climate Center. That's probably the most commonly used survey in our area. I've had many conversations with a representative from that organization. They are in the process of changing their survey. So they are completely changing their question set for next year. So if we used that survey, we would not be able to compare this year's results to next year's results because the question set would change. Also, because it would be an entire new question set that would need to go before all three boards to be approved. And we would just need to be realistic about the fact that we would be doing the same thing in another year. The third limitation that I saw was that that survey did not provide some of the questions that this committee in particular was interested in learning more about. They did not ask, the gender question was binary, and there weren't any open-ended questions. So again, when we go back to how can we hear the voices of all students, we would not have that opportunity.
But we won't be able to trend this year's survey anyway, because don't we have to sort of start from scratch to make sure that all the schools are asking all the same questions in a trendable way?
Well, so they map, right? So if we were to use the survey from the National School Climate Center, the questions map to one another. So the wording is changed just slightly from group to group. So with that survey, they actually begin at grade 3 and it goes to grade 12. But there's an elementary set of questions and then a middle school and high school set of questions. So they're really 2 different sets of questions for students and then staff and parents. And the representative showed me the mapping so that I could see that you could compare, because it was really tweaking it just slightly so that elementary age students would understand it and so that it would make sense for parents. Because you're talking about safety, it would be the parents' perception of whether their child feels safe at school, whereas it's a, firsthand view from the student.
I mean, here we go again with the survey.
Right.
With another survey, and I'm just thinking, at the end of the school year, I want to find out from each child, how was your school year? Have to maybe write an essay or something. And how much money do we spend for people to analyze these surveys? Maybe we can pay people to read these essays and take notes from the essays to guide our work. Like, I'm getting frustrated with surveys, and it just feels like an unending.
So since the survey is something that we are required to do, when we do see value in the individual responses, I do hear the frustration, but so what we are looking to do is to maintain the core climate survey internally for 1 more year and recommend some content revisions. So in particular, removing the questions that we asked last year that had to do with distance learning, remove some of the very low response open-ended questions. So for example, there's a question, there are 2 questions for elementary students that say, I like to come to school because, or I don't like to come to school because, and the responses tend to be things such as, I like my friends, I like to spend time with my friends, I don't like math, as an example. So the climate committees didn't find the responses to be particularly actionable, but what they wanted to do was to add additional open-ended questions that would be follow-ups. So when a student says, either I don't feel safe, or I don't feel respected, or I don't feel comfortable, that then there would be a follow-up question that says, and if you said no, please provide more information, so that we would be able to gather more information about the areas that we really want to hear more. We want to be able to take action. So that's the hope for those questions. Additionally, we need to add a question regarding race, which was not present at the middle school level. And they added a question regarding physical environment cleanliness. I told you about the open-ended responses. We want to revise some of the questions that had 2 terms that were really not like in the same question, so that it would be more clear what the students were sharing in their response. So that if a question, for instance, the bus rides are safe and positive, students are kind and respectful, they changed them so they would have just 1 term.
So be 2 parts. So
Students are kind. At the elementary level, many elementary school students actually have a hard time defining respect. That was actually one of the things that the climate committee was trying to work on. So to keep it at something that was more concrete for that age level. We also want to change the scale so that it's more consistent. You heard Dr. Glass say there were questions that were 4, there were questions that were 5, there were questions that were 3. There were questions that were 10. So we're looking at making that more consistent so that we could have an easier time looking at the responses across questions. There was also a question that was brand new for us last year, which had to do with security. Until last year, there has never been an issue with security with our climate survey. And we know that there were many concerns about the security of our survey. So in discussions with our director of technology, she said that there are ways to do this if we don't use SurveyMonkey. So there are ways that we can lock this down further. And there are basically 2 ways to do this. So in my work with her, we will find a way to do that. And then finally, to continue the external statistical analysis. I know that that is not the most important thing for this group, but the benefit of having an outside consultant who is a statistician is that they can help with the construction of the survey, and they can also help us to tease out the responses, to understand them in a way that we simply would not typically do. We don't run SPSS analyses at the K through 12 level. I mean, that's really something that's done at the university level, and something I did in my doctoral work, but it's helpful for them to be able to treat the information in such a way so that they can see if anything rises to the level of statistical significance. I would not suggest that we spend 10 hours doing it, but I think that there is value in having an outside consultant provide a different lens to our understanding.
Well, and one of the things that I heard from Dr. Glass every time he's spoken is if he would have been brought in to help construct the survey, his analysis would have been, he would have been able to stand by that analysis in a different way. And also he would have been able to tie questions together, like the bullying question that Dr. McKinnon had. He could have made sure that there were those 5 questions that he could then apply that analysis to. So like if we have help constructing, you have now a much better process at the end where you are able to ask better questions because those questions were constructed in a way and put on the survey in a way that allow for, I think, a better and more thorough analysis. And especially when we think about the voices we're trying to better understand, if the construction of the survey is designed more thoughtfully and by somebody who has that ability, then you can, it's just a much better process.
He also said at the high school level, it was too long. He said, I can tell that there's survey fatigue here because, yes, he did. He said that it's clear that the students sort of lose steam at the end, that the way that they're answering the questions tells him from his statistical view that they were either randomly choosing answers or they just stopped completing them. So that's really helpful feedback for us. So that's what we're looking at for this spring. We had every intention of being able to move forward with a purchase survey, and I reached out to all of the districts that are in our area, Dirk A and Dirk B, and I think some Dirk C as well. And many of them use internal surveys. Many of them use internally constructed surveys. Some of them use surveys from the National School Climate Survey, and there were a few that used a survey from Panorama. So those were the organizations that I heard of. And it doesn't make sense for us to bring a recommendation to the board to move toward a survey, which will cost us roughly $10,000, if it's not going to give us what we're really trying to learn.
So for the one for this spring, generally like we're providing pie charts just based on the overall. Are we able to create pie charts based on the minority groups that answer these questions versus just having it as a whole?
We can do that. That wouldn't be discussed at the school climate committee because I think there would be a concern that it would become identifiable. So at the district level, we could do it.
If it's in percentages, how would it be identifiable? So we were looking at a pie chart.
If it's for the whole school, it might not be, but it depends what the group is, right? It depends what it depends what subgroup you're talking about.
So this is one of the questions that I have. And perhaps one of you guys can answer it. I know at the climate committee level, we're looking at data for our own school, but yet we face the challenge of those in marginalized communities being so small that we don't get to look at their experiences differently. Now, when you look at the whole district overall, there's enough in each of those subgroups. If we're able to look and say, what is the district experience overall? There's enough in there that you can say as a percentage of the whole district, this particular group answered it this way. And I realize it doesn't necessarily tell us like what is that experience for that school, but it gives us an idea of what is the experience in these schools. And I think that is a way of doing it so that you're able to show that number and not even to give, and you don't even have to reveal what that total universe number is. It's just like as a percentage of all African Americans in ER9 school district, this is how these students answered, right? And always look at it as just percentage of numbers. That's it, because we want to maintain everyone's privacy. It might, in the middle school, that number would be way too small for us to be looking at. But the idea is we're trying to figure out what needs what areas need improving,
Mhm.
right? So if we're going to say, these are too small, so we can't share it, it's sort of, once again, it binds our hands into how we can change something. But if we would, but for those numbers that tend to be smaller, if we sort of like and you can have a caveat there. This is not necessarily indicative of this, but this is a profile of our district, of what it looks like. And then we could then sort of gain some aspect of what those experiences are like and make some recommendations. But I would rather we err on the side of doing it that way than on the side of completely silencing those experiences. Because the numbers are too small. And you're right, at John Reed, you couldn't do that. You could not.
Yeah, so it does depend on the subgroup, because for some of the questions, a student can choose multiple responses. So we could, so it is very possible, but I'm not sure that it would necessarily provide the voice of a single subgroup, but it could provide voices of many subgroups that might be different than the majority.
What you could say, for example, is, okay, we asked a question about school safety in the bathrooms. This is a profile of how everyone looked at, but, and normally you would have to sort of not show the data for African Americans because that number is too small. But we could also look at overall, how do African Americans feel about safety in the bathroom at ER9 schools?
Yeah, is that something, so, and technical sort of importance here, there are 3 separate and distinct districts. And so I wonder, is that something that we've done? Have we ever looked across Easton's district, Reading's district, and Region 9's district?
Yeah, I mean, that's
That's what Dr.
part of what he did.
And that, can that give us, but do we do that as a part of the regular?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
they
okay,
meet
that's
together
great.
as
So
a
sounds like-
group, and they look at the entire data set of ER9,
That's
and
right.
then they
So we're
flag the areas
Yeah.
that,
Well,
So
yes,
are we
but the
already
concern
doing
is, it's maybe happening internally. What I'm hearing, I think, is the challenge is it hasn't been shared externally. Is that a fair? So like internally, so inside the district climate team,
Mhm.
which it of the assistant principals and the district leadership, you are looking obviously at every subgroup,
Mhm.
analyzing that data and making action steps from that. But then what I'm hearing, there's a concern that that data that's being used internally, there's not insight to that data externally, whether it be on the school level climate teams where you have families or more broadly.
I mean, in all fairness, this year, for example, we didn't have it for.
Right, so it wasn't
ethnicity
even a
because it
question.
wasn't asked.
Correct. Yeah.
But moving forward, if we're doing that, that's a very key component when you're talking about safety that we know. And I'm not advocating for showing that number for that 6 number of kids in John Reed, but I would like to know overall, what is the experience of African-American kids in, as far as their perceived safety in the bathrooms for ER9. And the caveat has to be there that you're looking at this, and you can do this by saying, okay, this is specifically for this school, but because these numbers are too small, we're looking at it overall, and recommendations can come out of that for ways to make it, to do the experience, to improve the experience for everyone.
I guess just to back up a little bit, so my understanding of the climate survey, we're required to do it for Connecticut, right, state. And I guess, do we report something, each district reports something to the state, or do we just fill out a form saying, yeah, we did it?
we report to the state.
And then we have to communicate what actions we took as a result.
Yes,
of the-
we report to the state, and then in addition to that, our evaluation plan requires us to use the parent climate survey results to inform the school goals. And so each principal is responsible for doing the analysis of the parent climate survey results and having that factor into their work in the school. And that's written into the evaluation plan.
But I guess the concern, and I have the same concern, I participated in the Barlow Climate Committee survey. And what I'm hearing, and I have personal experience, so I'll speak as a person, not as a public servant, is that when you have small numbers or marginalized group, you're going to run the risk of getting muted by the majority. And it's never intentional. But even in the climate groups where we discussed the surveys, and we had in Barlow, we had a stratification by whatever demographic we collected, right? And so the overarching theme that came out of that group was the kids are stressed out, regardless of what they look, their backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. They're stressed out, COVID, a lot to learn, et cetera, et cetera. And the successive results that came out of that continued to be that. So to everybody's points, early discussion, that you have whatever the number is, let's just call it arbitrarily 5% of miscellaneous non-white groups, right? Or non-cisgender white groups. That aggregation of that minority is going to get silenced just because, you have to look at it on an anecdotal basis, right? So, and that's kind of where I know we have to do the surveys, it's good normative data, but we also have to remember, if in terms of going forward, that we have to think about all the data qualitatively, and we can't ignore, to me, I still go back to those, 500 Barlow kids that said they were marginalized for whatever reason or witnessed it. And so to me, that's enough for us to do. That's more than anecdotal. That's not survey data. And that's probably what we should be pivoting to. But I think what I'm hearing is that these one-off, 5% or whatever it is, are getting normalized out for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think what we've said all along is that we wanted to do a qualitative review of quantitative data. And that's, if there's a benefit to having an internal survey, it's that the entire participation is still small enough for us to analyze qualitatively, which is why we're adding open-ended questions as opposed to taking them away, which is what you would see in a package survey, which it makes more work for the reading, but it allows us to then read those individual responses and be more responsive to the information that we gather.
But there's still a need in some way, I think, to report information to the public and through this committee or through the boards, either way, or that allows for the experience that is not of white cisgendered students. And even if that requires, and I think you take the end value away and you figure out a way to say, these are the major concerns of, and maybe you may have to, I think there, again, if you go across districts, so in all of our K-8 schools or in our 2 K-5 schools or in our 2 middle schools, if you have a large enough end value where you don't get into any kind of FERPA concerns, to have that conversation, right? To say, like, this is a bigger concern in this community than it is and you don't even have to compare it to, like, this is a bigger concern in this community and we need to do more about it, whether it's bus safety or bathroom safety or
And I think
etc.
doing it that way is a way to convince members of those communities that it's worthwhile to fill out the surveys because their voices will be heard. Because what I'm hearing from a lot of people is, what's the point? They're just going to throw it away anyway. Doesn't matter what I say. So there's a frustration in those communities about this. And I would hate to see people not feel that, because we need to hear it to make it better. And being on the climate committee, I will say that for all the flaws of the current study, there is a lot of very useful data to at least give us an idea of what to improve. And the other side thing is, and the other thing that I've also said to the principal and the assistant principal there is, but there's also a lot of good data that I think we don't do enough of a job of saying what is good in our schools, right? Because the kids are telling us their experiences. So we're talking about what's not working, but there's also a lot of data. And the reason that I can say that is I got it in a format that was presentation charts, right? So I can look at it and I can say, and it's not trending and I can't break it up by different groups, but I can say, wow, I would have thought that there were a couple, I was like, I didn't think it'd be that high, but it was, and then then so what you got is like about like a good, I'd say 60 to 70% was really good stuff, right? And then you had like about maybe 30% that was like, we need to work on this. And out of that 30%, maybe 50%, we really need to work on this. But all of that is lost in the community because we're so micro-focused on it.
Mhm.
So if we have to do this data stuff, by all means, let this be the tool that we use. Let's make sure we have the right questions.
Mhm.
But at the same time, but let's also reassure that every person who answers, their voice is heard and presented. And for those, and what people are telling me, it's like, there's only 6 of us. They're not gonna listen to us anyway, right? So if we can look at it in another way and say, your voice will be heard, we can't break it out this way and this is why. And I'll be the first to say, from a market research background, I can tell you, this is not, we cannot do this. But if we could say, all 3 districts combined, this is the common experience of this group. To me, I think that builds in a lot of goodwill that has been lost in this process.
So we have a question for that, because I struggle with this personally, is that I agree, like communicating out to marginalized groups helps, but you get the other side of that.
Okay.
You get people who don't want to help those marginalized groups to be blunt. And what does that, and then we potentially go down the path we did last summer when we issued these surveys, and we had people with parents that they were living in the state coming and challenging the survey. And that's what I don't want. I want to protect those groups from those groups who really have no vested interest in providing substantive comment.
But here's the thing, at least my own personal experience with them, they're like, and we know that our town is a division, right? I think for the most part, most people, when you're able to say, this is what this shows, most people will say, oh, I didn't realize that. Right? Not everybody. There's a side that's always going to be like, I don't want to hear this at all. Right? This is skewed. But I think what I believe as a person of color is like having nothing to say, but wait, this is what this shows. People are like, why are we doing this? And that's the opposite. I think it's what my personal experience is the opposite. I've found there are people across aisles on different things. When you're able to actually show something, because even in the DEI calls, when people were like, well, if, people are being called racial, well, we need to stop that. That was from the other side. But the problem is we never showed them that was happening.
Yeah.
So I think if you're able to show that and say, this is what we did, these are the experiences, and guys, this is happening at all 3 districts. I think you will find a good number of people on the other side. That has been my personal experience. When people come to me and they say, well, when I'm able to share my experience, people are willing to sit down and have that conversation. But when you're not showing anything, but yet you keep telling them we have to do this, that's where frustration comes in. And that's where it looks like people who look like me are pushing a personal agenda onto our communities. And that's not what we're doing.
Well, it's also why, there was a student survey that I think a group of students did that had 500 respondents, and that is where we're hearing, people the N-word every single day. We're seeing white students seeing, different groups of students being treated differently, cisgendered students making comments in a, again, student-generated survey, responded, 500 plus kids. In the climate survey, I don't think, because the questions don't lend themselves to that, maybe there's a way in some of the open-ended questions to get, to try to have students respond. I don't think students are afraid to tell us that, especially as they get older. But often the climate survey doesn't, I think that the student survey that was generated had very specific questions, because those students that made the survey were speaking to their own experience and wanted to see our other students in this district, I think at the high school specifically, having that experience, which is why I think when we were talking about qualitative, how do you get folks to share that experience? Not only people on our committees, only people in a parent group, how do you also hear, and I think part of it is being honest and making sure that when we're talking about quantitative data, people don't feel like they're being further marginalized or hidden, right? Because then it's like, well, why should I tell you? You're not even reporting on this thing that you have to do. So how do we, build trust and then add in an additional opportunity or opportunities for folks to share those experiences? Because I think students are not many, at least from that one survey, it just felt like there was a lot of people who wanted to share that information with adults to do something.
If we have to do something, let's try to make it as useful as possible.
I think that's doable. I mean, I think the suggested revisions for this spring survey should provide more opportunities for students to provide us more information. So if they say that they don't feel comfortable, they say they don't feel safe, they say they don't feel respected, then there will be an opportunity for them to provide more information using this data collection tool. Okay, you ready to shift gears? You're plugged in.
Still have one person who's still on the meeting. Just making sure Chris is still here. Okay, so next on the agenda is membership. So the committee membership, which is defined in our committee charge, which I put here, this was adopted July 20th of 2020, is that we will strive to include diverse voices and perspectives by having 2 members of each of the boards, which we have currently, the assistant superintendent, Dr. Pearson-Ugal, and then also non-voting but active participant members of the committee, a student from each school, which should be 5 additional members, 2 members of each community, so 2 from Easton and 2 from Reading, and then a certified staff member from each school. Currently, we do not have student members from each school. I assume that, I don't know how, if we invited, and you may remember, I don't even know if I was on the board yet. If we had students from the elementary schools invited.
We did not.
Okay, it was
We
just
began
middle.
at the middle school level.
Okay. And then we're missing, again, members from staff members as well from the school, each school.
How many students do we currently have?
That's a great question. I think we had one who attended regularly. I think that one student member has moved to a different school. I think she graduated from one middle school to the high school. So I think we're down to really 0. And so that's what we're here to talk about, is what should we do about that? I think also when we have certified staff members from each school, we might be, so we have Kelly here. But again, I think an opportunity to open up an application process to encourage additional staff members, because has been so helpful to hear what's happening at the school and to, really share successes and challenges and hear stories. I think those experiences really come up when we have students and staff members sharing them. And then 2 members from each, 2 from Reading, 2 from Easton. And again, I didn't hear back from every community member. So I would want to reach out. I think there was one other person from Reading who did not respond. So just trying to find that person and see if she's still interested in being on the committee.
First about outreach to staff, what have we done?
So until recently, we had more staff members. We had 2 staff members who recently, just due to life commitments, decided to.
We had a staff member from each school.
We did. And so now we're down to actually 2 total sets. So one person who's not here tonight, Kelly is here. So we haven't done any outreach at this point because we have to approve the application process tonight before we can move forward to opening up the invitation.
Is there a limit?
I think we had, in the charge, we have 1 per school.
So are we looking for 4 students? 1 from each middle school? No, sorry, it says 3 students.
3 students. Yep. 1 member. We need 1 person, 1 community member from Reading, And then at least 3 certified staff members, potentially 4.
Would it be helpful to, for those of us who participate in climate committee, be helpful to have someone from that group be the person on this task force? From an edge, that way you have some continuity and you're not re-educating, if you will, you know, what would come out of, again, I know you want to get beyond climate, beyond the survey, but it might be helpful to have that, hear from that same group of educators and students. I know there are teachers and administrators in the climate committees, the ones at Barlow, to have somebody there. I think there are a couple of us like first and I own the Barlow one, right? So as parents, so, but it might be helpful to have that. We can kind of do a readout to the extent that that information can be shared publicly. At least we put some kind of communication around what's being done.
My experience is that SSCS is not good for DEI at all. So I don't know if that's something that has been talked about. That the goal is that or no?
Well, the climate committee would be about whatever topic would inform providing a
And I don't think it
safe
should,
school environment.
I don't think that should be. I don't,
But it's not prohibited.
right, it's not prohibited, but
From the discussions.
So it's over, so it's broader. It's anything, it's whatever stuff.
So if you consider the different categories, and I was sharing the different categories for the survey, the climate committee, I'm just pulling up the social and emotional security, the sense of social and emotional safety, the sense of physical safety, the role of adults within the community, the way that students treat one another. So all of that could include topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that's not the driver.
I think the confusion that Susan and I have is that our understanding is that this work would be pushed down to the climate committee to be done, but we don't talk DEI at those levels. I mean, that's what we've been told, that the work is going to be pushed down to the climate level. But that's not what's happening with either of us.
That's good feedback. I mean, in my mind, equity and inclusion are at the core of being safe in school. Like if you're not feeling, I mean, but if you're not talking about it, like if you're not feeling safe, included, if you're not feeling accepted, which is a core component of obviously DEI. And then if we're not meeting kids' needs, whether it be physical needs, emotional needs, academic needs, mental health needs, et cetera, then but I think it has to be called what it is, which I think people have gotten very nervous about using words because they see them as buzzwords, right? So maybe, but I think it's really good feedback to hear that if you're feeling,
Discussion of those things.
really?
Not at the Barlow level.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And Barlow has questions that has demographic questions that the lower school may not. And it's just not coming out. Honestly, to be honest, it's a nature of the group. And what their individualized experiences are, what their lived experiences are. Don't have those kind of lived experiences. We don't talk about that in the room. It's not coming out. And thus in the Barlow ones, again, it's coming out of student stress, which is perfectly, I mean, that is climate, right? You don't want our kids to be stressed out. We don't want them to. So that's coming, and that's been coming out in the context of that. But if that charge in climate includes that, then
Right.
you know, there should be another forum for, you know,
Right.
groups to be able to.
Yeah. Well, and stress is a behavior that we have because we're having needs that aren't met, which often are stemming from, right? So like, but if you're not talking about the unmet needs that are underlying the stress, then which often come from not feeling safe or not feeling included, yeah. Interesting.
I think that has been made the charge of those work, but it's not happening.
Okay. So the question I think that got us to having that good feedback is maybe going to the climate committees as our first place to say, hey, or maybe it would be helpful actually. Maybe I'm thinking about it correctly, is like, maybe it would be helpful to have folks, because then they would have a DEI lens as they go back to the climate committee. But they may not bring a DEI lens from the school to this task force is.
I'm on both, so when the opportunity presents itself, I mentioned it, but I would tell you, as I think you guys can figure out, I'm not shy, and I can tell you, it's never come up.
Okay, interesting. My concern is I think folks are nervous about being on this task force at times, because it has been at times very challenging to be, like, you can feel like you're in a hot seat. And so I think we should open the net as wide as it's an application process. Someone has to, which we'll look at in the next slide. And so I think we should be petitioning folks that we think would be great for it and trying, to get folks to apply, because frankly, I think my concern is more that we're going to have not enough, we're not going to have as much. I think people are interested, but nervous.
So what about the people that applied initially that didn't get in? Like, I know, like, Jillian Desiderio from SSES, social worker, like somebody that has experience.
Yeah,
Are they
and I think
considered
one of the
certified
things that we
staff?
want to talk about is what the application process will look like and how decisions will be made. My memory of last year was that there were not many people clamoring to serve on this task force. And so I think that's part of our conversation.
But I can go back. We have the Google form that was shared with us of applicants. And so it'd be a good place to start there. I think last year there was an application process where we asked a couple questions and people responded to those questions across the different groups that were in the charge. Suggested process for this year, we wrote and approved, this committee wrote, and then we went through the board process on May 25th. I think it was our longest board meeting in history. It was like 6.5 hours. Where we approved on May 25th, 2021. It may have actually been May 26th. I'm not sure. Yeah, it could have been. It was like 2 a.m. Where we approved our ER9 equity and inclusion statement. And this is a statement that, really after that date, we have done very little discussion of our action with. And I think bringing this potentially to the forefront, because we spent a lot of time and energy, and I think it captures so much of what's already in our charge and could help really refocus, but also really making sure applicants read the statement and respond to potentially the statement. But definitely, this was just one idea.
Yeah, I think it's telling that not too many staff members are excited about participating in this work, but I also think that the community has damaged the idea or the ideal of what this work should be. And I think it's on us to maybe go to a staff meeting and do some outreach for teachers. Because this work is so important that if I was an educator, I would want to be involved in making decisions and being a part of the change. So maybe we, as members, go to a staff meeting and say, hey, this is who we are. And we want you to be a part of the work.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to read too much into the number of people who were interested last year. I do believe last year was a very different year.
Yeah.
For this work, for teaching and learning, for having communication with people within and outside of our school communities. And I do have some hope that there are many more people who are interested in participating in this work. I think for our staff members who have worked a long day, I think it's hard to come back, but at the same time, I think being in person
this is a much better forum for having a conversation than staring at tiles on the screen
Yeah.
with potentially 100 people who are not part of the year 9 community.
When we were meeting monthly as well, and we have 4 standing meetings now, and we can add special meetings as needed. And we had meetings that lasted for, 3-4 hours. So potentially, I think for students in particular, was challenging because we would end so late at night. Sorry, Beatrix.
Yeah.
Which reminds, the question that I have, again, going back to what we talked about is, we were meeting monthly and now we're going back to quarterly. So, one of the things for us to be thinking about, if it's not an actual charge of the climate committees to do this work, with meeting 4 times a year, how effective can that be?
Well, we can meet more times. So we have 4 standing meetings. It's a special meeting can be called really at any point in time. I think we got out of a cadence of meeting as we waited for the reconstitution of this committee. So we have 4 standing meetings this calendar year. I think potentially we need to have a special meeting once we go through the application process to add new members. And I think I already have, 3 or 4 different things on the agenda for, one is revisiting the charge, because I think that we've now been doing this for a year plus. It's just like, what is this charge the right charge for what this group feels should be, what we should be doing? I think taking Dr. McKinnon up and Dr. Steph Pearson, you all up on, culturally relevant pedagogy. What are we doing to ensure that all students' needs are being met and experiences in different marginalized groups in particular are like, there's thought going into the way we're thinking about curriculum, the way we're thinking about assessment, the way we're thinking about teaching and learning. And then how are we better capturing qualitative experiences? And so we can absolutely do that. I think our next scheduled regular meeting is in June. And it's April 4th. So again, that's only 2 months away. But I think we could have a special meeting in May to discuss some of those things.
Now, I was just gonna say, maybe as we look at this results of the kind of service, these are the points that stuck out from a DEI perspective for us to look at. That way we can start to map out steps and targets that we're doing.
And that's a great question. I mean, that's one of the reasons we put, so I think the next, if you look at the minutes, the only reason I would even remember is June 6th. And we put that because this climate survey happens in May. And so the idea of a June 6th meeting was we would have the results of the climate survey.
And that climate survey will have race as well as gender.
So the one that,
so that would you understand, we don't have to go with the entire climate survey, but the points that stick out from a DEI perspective, those can be what we discuss, what we talk about.
Yeah. And also I think getting to the earlier concerns about, are we focused so much on survey? So like, in addition to that, what is happening in the schools, especially as we close out the year?
And that should include like professional development, all sorts of other things as well. And the reverse of that is, okay, but we also found this in the survey that we have to do. And because of that, we're also developing this. This is our plan of action. I think I'm very curious to see us at least start to move in some direction. If we're going to have this tool, this is a tool that we can use to at least be able to show the community these are certain, not that we are bound and locked in by this, but these 3 points clearly stood out. And as we look to planning for next year, these are some of the steps that we're considering doing, or that we are, we're keeping this in the back of our mind as we look at our plans.
Right.
To just say something. Otherwise, if we're not
doing
anything,
and that was the intention of the September meeting. So like when we give that feedback in June, most boards, we don't typically meet boards of education in July. We get a whole month off. And then I think coming back in September, giving the administration, our central office team, as well as the school personnel teams time to, again, what is the plan for this year so that we can check in on that plan. And then potentially there's a special meeting if needed, but the December meeting was really budget focused, like what DEI, what, because January is typically when we have a tri-board meeting where we start talking about central office requests for budget. And so thinking about, are there budget requests we need to push up to the board or push whichever direction to the boards so that we're able to make sure that there's resources to fund any kind of a different type of survey or PD or a curriculum audit or things like that.
It'd also be great to know like what's already been happening, especially as you mentioned, you know, behind the scenes, you guys are talking about school climate and where the issues are, you know, we don't know what's being done about it, so it'd be great to get updates on that as well.
Yeah, we can certainly do that.
Okay, my FOIA police are not here and they would be very mad at me for going. No, it's fine. I just like, I'm not great at this. Okay. So just as we go back to the application process, are folks comfortable with sharing this statement? So one, I love the idea of going to the different communities, inviting folks in through staff meetings or however we can best encourage, especially our staff members, to join us, having them just respond, what does the ER9 ENI statement mean to you?
So I'm looking at this for a middle schooler and like that's a chunk.
Oh, for middle school students,
For a middle school student, that's a chunk.
the ENI statement.
Yeah, that's a chunk to ask them to write about what they want. I mean, I think it helps to keep it at a level that they can take. I mean, I you know what I mean? Or maybe it's just me. That's a
It
lot.
can be prompted by an adult.
Yeah.
If I was a parent trying to encourage my child, that's what I would do. I would sit and have a conversation about, you know, the statement and how did it resonate with you, and just, you know, jot down some notes about it. And use
Unpack
that.
the terms.
Huh?
Yeah, I think you would unpack the terms.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think it really depends on how it's presented.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I mean, I wouldn't want to give students, I wouldn't say that this is one menu option that every student has to consider and
Right.
complete in 30 minutes, because no, they're not going to do a close reading of that statement.
So do we ask the parents for some permission for this student to be a part of this? How are they getting
I
this?
because it was done. by
Yeah.
the Chair of this committee, I
Yeah.
don't know what the application process.
So I would have to check. I'm not, like I came on right after, I remember reviewing folks' applicants, but I would have to check and see how we,
As a
with
parent, I'd be
students.
offended if I wasn't involved. in this.
I'm sure, yeah, I'm sure, yeah, I think
I'm just imagining.
my guess is
how
that,
does the
yeah.
student get this?
I think it went out
If
in
it's just to
the,
me, I'm talking to myself.
Yeah, I think it went out to the, yeah.
He's still looking to go.
So Helen Keller, I'm assuming Helen Keller has their middle school newsletter that Dr. Clapp sends
Yeah.
weekly. It's like the best communicator. And then I believe there's a similar at the middle school in Reading and the high school, they also have it. So it would go through some sort of parent communication channel that would then be communicated to students. I think in the high school, it may be,
Students receive the list.
yeah,
Students receive emails that at the middle school and elementary school level.
in the high school they do, right?
I don't know if they receive all of them, but I think there's a lot more information that goes directly to the students. Well, you're both parents.
And I'm trying to remember what Dr. King was the high school when we set this up, right? So I think she had recommended to students that participate. I don't remember if they were.
But they would have had to apply.
Yeah, through her office, I think. But, and then the administrative staff of Barlow, I think, was also recommended somehow, like, there were a couple, you know, by administrators. School, or if we want to provide. We didn't have we had the charter, I think we had the purpose last year, but didn't have the statement.
Correct.
Right.
They were responsible.
So, yeah.
Right.
but
I think starting with like the heads of schools and the assistant principals is especially for students going through the parent newsletters, but for teachers, again, communicating. And I think I love the idea of, going and answering questions or. Is there anything, Kelly, you can think of? I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but as a staff member.
I think each school tends to have its own target. I think each one sort of has its own personality and stuff like that. We've been to a couple of years. I don't think the lack of volunteerism is reflective of a lack of interest.
Yeah, okay. So to move this forward, we need a motion, right? Yep.
Can we have the current list
It's-
of?
Yeah. So that's what, I'm gonna work with Stephanie on that over the next week, because I literally was getting responses from folks when I sent out the meeting planner thing. So I now know who it is, and I've got a marked up copy at home. So yes.
And we'll put that on the website. as
Mhm.
well.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
We don't put students.
No, they were on there, but I don't know if we should. That's a good question, but they are. The student reps are listed on the current committee breakdown, but I don't know.
But not their content.
No, they're just name, first name, last name.
I want to put their initials the first day, last name.
I'm not sure.
But right now, we don't have any students.
We currently do not have any students, but there are students still listed. So those, yeah. So that is what we're working through now. Okay, so
What is it trying to do?
So in order to begin this application process, do we need a motion to
Begin this application.
process?
What's it new?
Going back, I feel like we empowered the chair of the committee.
It is in the charge that the chair of the committee,
to do
yeah,
stuff like this before.
great.
Yes, they have the same memo. We Howard, the chair.
I thought the chair had broad discretion to be in charge of appointment.
Oh, great. Okay,
And I'd be happy to do that.
okay, ditto. Okay. Any further discussion of our application process or the current committee membership? Awesome. Committee member comment.
Guys, I came across a quote today and I want to share it because, we're spending a lot of time doing this work. And I think I said it right when I became a part of this committee about, just my personal philosophy of being and living a diverse life. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the monk who sold his story.
I love that.
He was a multi-millionaire and sold everything and started selling his life as a monk. And I subscribe to his daily quotes and his books, but he said, today, perhaps travel cannot prevent bigotry, but by demonstrating that all people cry, laugh, eat, worry, and die. We can introduce the idea that if we try and understand each other, we may even become friends. So I just wanted to share this with you. I pray for a world where our kids will just be friends. Embrace each other and friends. Whatever we have to do to get there, and feel safe. And feel safe. Whatever we have to do to get there, let's do it.
Thank you. Any further comment?
So the time doing the work, sorry, I was still. I would like to add on the agenda action steps or thing, or we're stuck in special meeting land, so we have to be very specific about the agenda. Exactly what narrowing the chart or changing the chart, which we've already discussed. And trying to, in the context of that, trying to understand what our function is. Because I feel like, with all due respect, everybody's time and effort, we've been talking about moving things. I feel like we haven't been doing things. And part of that's been the climate we had to deal with last year and the community's responses to the survey. So I really want to be thoughtful and practical about what this committee's purpose is, and actually set achievable goals, even if those goals may be take a year and a half to do. And I want to, again, respectfully get past talking about it.
And quite close to do that is, and try to be as transparent as we can with me, in what the goals are, and as we're going through them, and this is what's already been done, this is what's happening, this is what we're thinking about, so that people can understand the work that's being done. And it also that holds us all accountable to the work that's being done, but it also it shows progress, and it shows that we are truly committed to doing this work. And I'm always one much more in favor of more information than less. And I think it will go a long way if we can be transparent about what we're doing to sort of bridging some of the gaps in perception about what this work is about for those who are closer.
Any other comment? Anybody online? Great.
None.
Okay. And then finally, looking for a motion to adjourn. Second? All in favor? Okay.
Aye.
Our meeting is adjourned at 8:20 or 8:31 p.m. Thank you, friends online. Have a great night.
Thanks. Good night.